It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker is Mair. He is the national president of the Sierra Club. He is the first African American president of the organization, and he has more than 30 years of experience in organizing and in activism. One of the many fights that he was involved with over that period is a decade-long battle that led to the closing of a solid waste incinerator in an inner-city community in Albany, New York. Aaron is a graduate of Binghamton University with a degree in history and sociology. He also trained at Rhode Island's Naval Education Training Center and attended the American University in Cairo. So with that, please welcome Aaron Mair.
Good morning. Did y'all have coffee this morning? Good morning. Get a little exercise. Let me get those lungs working. Resist. Recruit. Train. And sustain. Let's now a little bit more. Now, Reverend, you Pastor, Pastor Miller. I mean, she was up here early to warm you up a little bit, get that oil. Again, resist. Recruit. Train. And sustain. A little bit more about me. I know there was a little brief point about this guy being the president of the Sierra Club. Some of you may know what that means, may not know what that means. And first African American, some of the, well, okay, is there some sort of token appointment? No, the Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest frontline activist, conservation, environmental, and now I would say justice organization. It was founded with the recognition at the turn of almost 2 centuries ago, the late 19th century going into the 20th century, that the rapid industrialization of the United States of America was wiping out our natural resources that for generations that were, as I say, to be stored and protected for posterity, would never see again. It was the vision of John Muir to bring to the world, to the country at that point in time, as I say, to bear witness to what we were losing, and to give America a wake-up call. And what he did was one of the most profound outings. He took somebody out to see what was being lost so that he can affect change. That person that he took was a gentleman by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, who himself was a hunter, etc. We all know Teddy's past. But the point of the matter is, he took the President of the United States on an outing to the Yosemite Valley to bear witness to what we were losing that was indeed sacred. You can't put words to it. You have to experience it. So that transformative event over 100 years ago, basically led to the creation of our national park system. Think about that. Bearing witness to what we're losing and then getting a national leader to take national leadership to protect for American posterity these natural wonders, these places and these spaces, not only for all Americans to enjoy, but also to pass on in perpetuity for our future heritage. These are the commons. These are sacred things that you don't sacrifice or offer up for the sake of immediate corporate gain. At that particular point in time, America witnessed a difference between the value in the normative sense versus value, as they say, in the verbal sense. Value in the verbal sense from an economic model, you got a natural resources, you will drill it, frack it, blow it up, use it for the maximum gain. But value in the noun sense is the value of the book of Genesis. Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah. Could you hear me before? Yeah. So the noun sense of value goes back to that ancient biblical sense of the book of Genesis, of us being stewards of creation. But not only creation, but our dependence in that big cycle that all things are connected. And being stewards was not to use it for the here and now, but to preserve it for generations and posterity to come. Now, I know that some of my religious brothers and sisters, Reverend, take that notion of prophecy where now they're going to step in the foot or the shoes of God and talk about the end of times, and so it's all going to go away, so we just need to prepare for the second coming, versus those of us who recognize that, if that's the case, that's God's work. That's God's work. What God expects of man is to be the stewards of creation, regardless of what the prophecy is. Regardless of what the prophecy is. So one of the things that I work with organizations like Sojourners and others is to push what is our role of stewardship, but also tying it into that beautiful mission that, again, that these things are sacred pieces and connections that we must maintain for the survival of our species. These things are very, very, very critical. And so that early recruitment, that early training and sustaining that value, and Teddy Roosevelt by John Mair has been passed on to me. How did I come to this movement? Well, I came, as you heard, from the environmental justice movement. But before the environmental justice movement, which I was one of the folks that helped build that movement, I came from a strong labor organizing movement. My father was a shop steward in General Motors Union 664 in Tarrytown, New York. He was a World War II veteran, and he was what we call of the Harlem Left. And if anybody has ever studied labor politics and labor mobilization, you know that the Harlem Left was back in the days when, you really had a radical, workers-driven and justice movement with that population, from everything from the civil rights, a lot of the justice rights, as I say, was the backbone of the Harlem Renaissance, because before you can have the arts, you have to have a material base to support those arts. That Harlem Left was very critical. They served this nation in spite of being left, but coming back, they also got their GI benefits and GI bills, and they built the community. Now, they tried to build it in New York City, but a guy by the name of Fred Trump had things called restrictive covenants. So GI Bill, okay, even though this was taxpayer money coming in for the benefit of veterans who served this nation in its hour of need, when it came to providing housing for those African American Latino veterans, when they came back to New York, they faced racial covenants. So my father and a lot of those guys ended up settling up in what they call northern Westchester County. It's a outer burb of New York City. Back in those days, if you saw the movie Hello, Dolly, a place called Yonkers was called the Country, which is literally right outside the border of northern Manhattan. But a place called Peekskill, where I grew up, where they have Indian Point nuclear power plant, that was considered, almost like Antarctica. I mean, it was back then. We did not have the transportation infrastructure that we do now. It was a haul. But the point being is this: is that those men came together, even in that community, to teach a very, very powerful value that survived through me to this day, and that is the conditions of a worker, the conditions of a community, determines the conditions of the environment and what people, as they say, will have to live and put up with. In other words, even that vision of John Mair's taking it a step further. While it was economic necessity, as I said, it was economic exploitation that was destroying our natural resources. The thing that was missing was the degradation of workers and laborers, and that would lead them to also destroy and, as I say, create unique threats. And so my father pointed out that, listen, these things are tied to a decent wage, a living wage, and a living job. You cannot talk about, as I say, just transportation or even good environmental conditions without decent living wage. Otherwise, in that, people will sacrifice their environment for their bellies. And this is very critical. This is very critical. Again, I came here to talk about transportation, but I want to drill it down to a bit bigger context, because we are in the wake of a huge sea change nationally and politically, and I want to break that down a little bit as well. But transportation is a critical piece of that, because it's when we talk about a living wage and just wages, you got to have the means to get to that wage. You got to have the means to get to that job. So when people like my dad back in the day were put a great distance from their jobs, they had to fight for transportation and mass transit to get to General Motors in Tarrytown, because it took him a while before he was able to buy a car. transportation is critical to the elevation of one's family. But the Sierra Club plays a very unique and special role in this regard. Here locally in Milwaukee, we are a part of the efforts to push back, as I say, and fight for options that will move monies from a massive highway investment to, which will cost over $1 billion, to fund, as I say, the basic needs of what's happening here in this community. But again, providing decent transportation. You heard the issues of the quality of transportation, but also, more importantly, issues like the passes. Right now, the current model is designed to facilitate, as I say, big industry, big suburbs. Big suburbs are dying, so right now it's really more or less how do we make jobs to move oil from one place to another, coal from one place to another, gas from one place to another. And these things are real dollars and real choice. But we also know that there's another side of the battle. Because one of the things that we know that what government can do at this particular point in time is that they can shift those priorities. In other words, if it's working good for the public, how can we politically break it, dismantle it, and divert the revenues elsewhere? And these are real challenges that are going to be even more serious that we're going to face in the upcoming administration. So when I led off to the point of talking about resist, recruit, train, and sustain, it's about how do we come together to build that movement, as I said, to shift that power back to the people so that we can have just transition.